Election day, believe it or not, is just 145 days away, and we are getting in a slew of new numbers that give us a snapshot of where we stand now. Let's start at the top of the ticket in the race for the White House. Joe Biden, he leads President Trump by 8 points. That's according to the Real Clear political polling average. I should note that many polls show the former VP up by much more into the double-digit area code. 538, they show that President Trump's approval rating sits at 41% and trending downwards. 55% disapprove of the job that he's doing. Democrats also leading the GOP by about 8 points in a generic congressional ballot by 538. And joining us now is their elections analyst, Geoffrey Skelley. And like I said, with the benefit of a date that we can use here as a window to between now and the election, from a historical standpoint, the margin the incumbent president is trailing, and also how people are identifying along party lines, how bad news is that for an incumbent with those kind of headwinds?
Well, I think if you look back at the historical polling data, the president is in possibly the worst position an incumbent has been in basically the history of scientific polling. And if you're looking at a president's approval rating being in the low 40s, historically that's a position where the incumbent usually loses re-election. Now, obviously, as you said, there's 145 days until election day, so there's time for that to change, for the race to narrow. But the current data is certainly not good for the president.
And to me, I was thinking really hard, Geoffrey, about, well, what kind of narratives could the president go to or look forward to that might change in his direction? We're going to talk about later in the program, but the new numbers for COVID and the projections here for where we could be in September and the fall look daunting. We're going in the wrong direction, unfortunately, in a lot of even red states. Moreover than that, the economic projections. I mean, we just saw the Fed, what they laid out yesterday, and the market taking a beating today. It doesn't look like we're going to be in a major rebound come the fall as well. And I go through all the metrics, even what we're seeing right now with the protests and the racial unrest right now. All that said, I have a hard time coming up with a storyline that things are going to be much better for him in the fall than they are now. It just doesn't seem to be laying out for a plausible place that this could radically change at least the numeric arc.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think it's difficult to see that. However, there is another component to this election, and that's Joe Biden. And so I think what you're going to see is the Trump campaign try to paint Biden with as negative a brush as possible. So it could be something of a race to the bottom, not dissimilar from what we saw in the 2016 election when you had really the two most unpopular nominees in modern times. So trying to lower Biden's favorability ratings to have the public view him more negatively is maybe the only way I could see Trump evening out what are not great conditions for him otherwise.
Yeah, a fascinating number I just saw is public opinion on Black Lives Matter in the last 2 weeks has so skyrocketed, and it's created a real political problem for not just obviously the president, but the party. I noted that of the 14 Senate races deemed really competitive where Republicans are trying to protect their seat, not one of them, Geoffrey, has the president in their most recent ads. How vulnerable is the GOP majority in the Senate, and how much do incumbent senators look at their landscape and see the president as more harm than help?
Well, we've definitely heard some news reports in recent days and even in the last couple of months that talk about Republican leaders being worried about President Trump dragging them down. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, in that presidential coattails, or lack thereof, is an important part of what happens in presidential elections. If one side does a lot better than the other, that candidate can pull other candidates from the same party along or sink them on the other hand. So in this case, if you're thinking about the U.S. Senate playing field, Republicans are defending more seats, and they're defending a number of seats that are in states that in an even electoral environment are maybe marginally Republican. I think of a state like North Carolina, for example. But if Joe Biden were to win nationally by 6, 7, 8 points, something Barack Obama won by about 7 in 2008, you're shifting that overall environment to a point where those states that might be very marginally red or even somewhat more marginally red, like, say, an Iowa, which President Trump carried by 9 in 2016, suddenly those states are even or even leaning toward the Democrats, in part because of that connection between what's happening at the top of the ticket and down ballot. And in 2016, every single state that had a Senate race went for the same party at the presidential level as at the Senate level. And there's just not a lot of split ticket voting today. And so, yeah, I think that's a real concern for the GOP.
Finally, the fiasco that we saw in Georgia. How much, I know it's impossible to quantify, but can you put your arms around what kind of a hot mess we could be looking at here in November? In that a lot of people say, hey, if you think it's just a problem for Georgia, you better think again. Plus, you couple that with a growing chorus of legitimate people who are saying this president will not go quietly, regardless of even a landslide into the good night here, if he can even grasp at an idea of a compromised election. Talk about not just the worst case scenarios, but the issues of election integrity in so many states right now and the real concerns we have, like I said, 145 days from an election.
Right. Well, obviously, the country is trying to figure out how to vote in the midst of a pandemic. And we don't know exactly what things are going to be like in the fall, but I can say that the primaries that many states have held during this period have not been cause for much confidence. Now, that does suggest that, the states can learn some from what's been going on and try to do better. But at the same time, it's not reassuring at all. And I think one of the things that really does concern me from sort of just a general standpoint about public attitudes toward the election and what's going on is that it's very likely that because of a large increase in mail-in balloting in many states around the country, many that don't really have much of a tradition of that, because of the coronavirus concerns, it's very possible that we're not going to really know the full extent of the election results on election night. And I do worry about rushes to judgment and calls that, votes that we're counting, the next day and the day after, they shouldn't count for some reason, that sort of thing. Just because they arrived maybe by election day or in time. But this is where the fact that we have a federal election system where each state sort of runs their own system is potentially problematic, because you might have one state that says, as long as it was mailed by election day, California is famous for this, for instance, we'll count it. So that might mean, it shows up 4 or 5 days later. But other states, you got to have them in by election day. And so it creates room for the sort of rumor mongering and scaremongering about election integrity that I do think could be used by President Trump in that circumstance. I mean, it didn't stop him in 2016 from claiming there were 3 million illegal votes when there was no evidence for that. I think that you could see President Trump do that again.
As if we needed any more headaches for 2020. But Geoffrey, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much for the time.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
And up next, we will pivot to the coronavirus pandemic. Some disturbing new numbers and projections about where we are and where we could be heading in the coming months as this outbreak continues. ABC News Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Jen Ashton, she'll join us to discuss.